There is a moment in every empath's life that feels less like fate and more like a deliberate strike from the universe itself. The moment you meet the person who was never meant to love you, but was absolutely meant to break something inside you. Not to destroy you, but to expose the parts of you that were never truly yours. And here is the paradox that almost no one talks about. Before true love ever enters your life, the universe sends you the narcissist, not the soulmate, not the partner who cherishes you, but the shadow messenger who carries the exact frequency needed to activate the wounds you've been avoiding for years. This isn't punishment, it's preparation. It's the universe saying, you want love? Then first you must see everything inside you that keeps pushing love away. Every empath believes they are ready for real love long before they truly are. They believe their kindness is maturity, their empathy is wisdom, their self-sacrifice is devotion. But what they don't realize is that beneath all this light lives an unconscious hunger, a hunger to be validated, to be chosen, to be enough. The narcissist senses this hunger instantly, and that is why they arrive first. Not because they are destined to stay, but because they are destined to reveal. This is the prelude to true love, the shock, the collapse, the confrontation with your own shadow. In Jung's language, the narcissist is the embodiment of the unconscious other, the one who forces you to meet the forgotten parts of your soul. Before you can enter a conscious relationship, you must first dismantle every illusion about who you are and what you think love is supposed to feel like. And that is why this story begins in the dark. Because the universe does not send the right person to heal you. It sends the wrong one to awaken you. Only after you've seen your wounds clearly, only after the mirror has shattered, only after the ego has cracked open, can the soul finally recognize the person who is meant to walk beside you. This video begins at the point most people try to forget, the moment the universe interrupts your life with a person who seems like a blessing but was designed to be the fire that forges your awakening. And once you understand this paradox, everything that happened to you, every betrayal, every silent night, every tear, finally makes sense. Empaths do not attract narcissists because they are weak. They attract them because they carry a rare emotional frequency, one that is warm enough to soothe a wounded psyche, yet undefended enough for that psyche to feed on. Their sensitivity is not the problem, it is the invitation. Narcissists move through the world with an internal void, a psychological hunger they cannot fill on their own. When they meet an empath, they meet someone who radiates exactly what they lack: presence, attunement, emotional depth, and unconditional acceptance. And to a narcissist, this feels less like love and more like survival. But the deeper truth lies below the surface. The empath's light is only half the equation. The other half is the empath's shadow, the unhealed wounds that create an unconscious opening. Empaths who fear abandonment unconsciously gravitate toward people who withhold affection. Empaths who equate love with self-sacrifice naturally tolerate emotional imbalance. Empaths who have never been allowed to take up space are drawn to partners who dominate it. This is not fate, it is psychological resonance. What looks like chemistry is often two subconscious wounds shaking hands. The empath sees the narcissist's charm and intensity and mistakes it for depth. The narcissist sees the empath's compassion and mistakes it for permission. Both are responding not to who the other is now, but to who they once needed in childhood. Jung called this the collision of shadows. Two people meeting from the parts of themselves they do not yet understand. The pull feels magnetic because it is karmic, not romantic. The empath feels seen at first because the narcissist mirrors their ideal self. The narcissist feels powerful because the empath mirrors their false self. This exchange is not love. It is an unconscious contract. I will give you the reflection you crave, and you will give me the validation I cannot generate. The universe allows this match not because it is good, but because it is necessary. It brings to the surface everything the empath has avoided: the desire to be enough, the need to be chosen, the habit of overgiving, the inability to say no. Narcissists do not create these wounds, they reveal them. They expose the fracture lines in the empath's identity, the exact places where true love would break through later. This is the unseen dynamic. The empath's gift and the empath's wound align perfectly with the narcissist's hunger and the narcissist's emptiness. And until the empath sees this clearly, they will think they are unlucky in love. But they are not unlucky. They are being shown the blueprint of what must be healed before love can stay. The greatest misunderstanding in the empath's journey is believing the narcissist was ever meant to be their partner. They were not. They were the initiation, a psychological doorway disguised as a person, a catalyst wearing the mask of a lover. Their purpose was never companionship, it was revelation. The narcissist enters the empath's life like a spark dropped onto dry wood, sudden, bright, intoxicating and destructive in a way that forces transformation. Their charm isn't love, it's the anesthetic that makes the operation possible. Their attention isn't intimacy, it's the hook required to pull the unconscious wounds to the surface. When they idealize you, they activate your longing. When they withdraw, they activate your fear. When they devalue you, they activate your shame. Their behavior touches every wound you thought you had outgrown. This is not an accident. It is the psychological choreography that forces the empath to confront the parts of themselves they have abandoned. In Jungian terms, the narcissist functions as the shadow emissary, the one who carries the qualities the empath has repressed. They embody power the empath avoids, selfishness the empath denies, boundaries the empath has never learned to hold. Their presence forces the empath to see that compassion without boundaries is not virtue, it is self-erasure. Through the narcissist's coldness, the empath becomes aware of how deeply they crave warmth. Through the narcissist's inconsistency, the empath sees how long they've tolerated emotional unpredictability. Through the narcissist's manipulation, the empath realizes how easily they trade their truth for peace. The narcissist does not create the empath's suffering, they illuminate it. They push the empath into situations where their coping strategies no longer work. The empath cannot fix them. The empath cannot heal them. The empath cannot love them into wholeness. And the moment this realization lands, something inside the empath cracks open. Not in despair, but in clarity. The empath begins to see the narcissist not as a soulmate, but as a mirror. Not as a partner, but as a teacher carved from the darkest parts of their own history. This is why the connection feels spiritual even when it is toxic. The soul recognizes an initiator long before the mind does. The pain is not random, it is precise. The narcissist destabilizes the empath just enough to expose the illusion of unconditional giving. They strip away the fantasy that love must be earned. They dismantle the identity built on self-sacrifice, and in doing so they force the empath into the first stage of awakening, understanding that love is not proven through suffering. The narcissist's role ends the moment the empath begins to see. Once the lesson emerges from the chaos, the relationship loses its power. The initiate has taken the first step out of the dream, and this is the turning point. The moment the empath stops viewing the narcissist as the center of their world and starts recognizing them as the threshold. The final trial before the life they truly deserve. The breaking point never arrives loudly. It slips in quietly, during a conversation that suddenly feels wrong, in the hollow tone of a message that once felt warm, in the way your body flinches before your mind can explain why. The moment the illusion cracks is rarely dramatic, it's psychological. It's the instant your nervous system recognizes a truth your heart has been trying to avoid. This is not love, it is self-abandonment wearing the mask of devotion. For the empath, the shattering feels like internal collapse. It is the disorienting realization that the person you fought for was never fighting for you. Your mind tries to replay memories, hunting for signs you should have seen. Your heart tries to negotiate, hoping that maybe you just misunderstood. But the body, the one place that cannot lie, knows exactly what happened. The mirror broke, the spell ended, the projection dissolved. This is the moment Jung described as the withdrawal of projections, when the image you cast onto someone can no longer hold. You no longer see a soulmate, you see a pattern. You no longer see destiny, you see your wound. You no longer see a future, you see the cost of staying blind. The empath who once blamed themselves for everything begins to recognize the emotional architecture of the relationship, the cycles of idealization and punishment, the subtle shifts that made them question their worth, the way they kept giving more to receive less. The shattering is painful because it requires you to grieve two losses at once: the person you thought they were and the version of yourself who believed that losing your boundaries was the same as loving deeply. The empath realizes they were not merely hurt, they were conditioned to accept unpredictability as passion, conditioned to shrink so the other person could feel large. But with the pain comes unprecedented clarity. You see the narcissist behavior without the fog of hope. You see your own longing without the veil of fantasy. You see the truth not as a threat, but as liberation. The collapse is not the end. It is the exposure of every unconscious contract you signed with your past. If I give enough, I will be loved. If I endure enough, I will be chosen. In this stage, the empath confronts the most frightening realization of all. The relationship wasn't breaking because the narcissist failed to love. It was breaking because the empath finally stopped betraying themselves. The moment the illusion shatters is the moment the empath steps out of the story they were trapped in. And though it feels like ruin, it is actually the first breath of freedom. The psychic spell is broken. The empath begins to return to themselves. Awakening does not begin with a decision. It begins with a realization. One so quiet and undeniable that it rearranges the empath's entire inner world. After the shattering of illusions, something shifts in the empath's perception. They are no longer overwhelmed by the narcissist's behavior. They are observing it. The emotional fog that once blurred everything begins to clear, and for the first time, the empath sees the dynamic not from their longing, but from their truth. What truly awakens the empath is not anger, not revenge, not even heartbreak. It is recognition. Recognition that the relationship was never balanced. Recognition that their role was always to carry the emotional weight. Recognition that they have mistaken chaos for intensity and instability for love. This recognition moves through the psyche like a quiet earthquake, gentle on the surface but powerful enough to shift the foundation. As this inner clarity settles, the empath's energy begins to withdraw naturally, not as a tactic, but as a response to truth. They stop reacting because the story no longer pulls them in. They stop defending themselves because they finally see there is nothing to defend. They stop trying to be understood because they understand themselves. And this subtle withdrawal is what rattles the narcissist most. Not the loss of affection, but the loss of influence. Silence becomes the empath's first boundary. It is not a wall, it is the end of absorption. The empath is no longer a sponge for someone else's fear, insecurity, or chaos. They begin holding their emotional space with a steadiness that feels unfamiliar, yet strangely grounding. This new internal posture signals a profound psychological shift. The empath is no longer oriented around the narcissist's needs. They are reorienting around their own. From the narcissist point of view, this shift feels like defiance. But from the empath's perspective, it feels like remembering. Remembering what peace feels like. Remembering what self-respect feels like. Remembering that love is not measured by how much pain they can endure. As the empath grows quieter inside, they begin to notice patterns that were once invisible. They see how often they stepped into the role of healer without being asked. They see how many times they accepted emotional crumbs while offering full devotion. They see how long they tried to rescue someone who never intended to meet them halfway. And with this awareness comes a subtle but powerful shift. The empath stops internalizing the narcissist's behavior. They stop making excuses for it. They stop taking responsibility for it. They stop interpreting it through the lens of hope and start interpreting it through the lens of reality. This is the true awakening, Not a dramatic turning point, but an internal reorientation. The empath's compassion begins turning inward. Their energy stops leaking. Their emotional boundaries form almost instinctively. And the narcissist, who once thrived on their openness, now finds nothing to latch onto. The empath's awakening is not a rising, it is a returning to themselves after being lost inside a story that was never meant to hold them. And once this return begins, the power dynamic shifts permanently. Transformation begins the moment the empath stops trying to return to who they were before the relationship. That version of them was too open, too forgiving, too willing to trade pieces of themselves for a glimpse of connection. The awakening introduced clarity, but transformation requires something deeper, the courage to face the parts of themselves they once denied. This is where shadow work begins, not as a spiritual concept, but as a psychological necessity. As the empath withdraws their energy from the narcissist, they suddenly encounter an unexpected silence within themselves, a silence that reveals everything they had been avoiding, the loneliness they tried to outrun, the fear of not being enough, the belief that they had to compensate for their existence through constant giving. These realizations sting, but they also illuminate. They show the empath the true origin of their vulnerability, not the narcissist, but the unresolved chapters of their own story. This stage is not about blaming the self, it is about understanding the self. The empath begins to trace the emotional threads backward. Why did I tolerate inconsistency? Why did I ignore my intuition? Why did I feel responsible for someone else's emptiness? The answers do not bring shame, they bring clarity. The empath sees that they were reenacting old wounds, the desire to be chosen, the fear of being dismissed, the habit of over-functioning in relationships to avoid abandonment. That's a key. It's the habit of over-functioning in relationships to avoid abandonment. In Jungian language, this is the confrontation with the shadow. The moment the empath faces the parts of themselves they had rejected, their anger, their unmet needs, their desire for reciprocity, their longing for stability. These parts were never flaws, they were simply unacknowledged. When the empath finally allows them to speak, something profound happens. The shadow stops sabotaging them from the dark and begins guiding them from within. As this integration deepens, the empath's emotional landscape changes. They no longer rush to soothe others because they recognize the cost of abandoning themselves. They no longer romanticize potential because they value reality over fantasies. They no longer seek intensity because they understand that stability is not boring, it is safe. And slowly, the empath's heart begins to reorganize itself around truth, not longing. This inner transformation becomes the foundation of their rebirth. The empath starts establishing boundaries without guilt, expressing needs without fear, and recognizing manipulation without collapsing. Their empathy becomes discernment. Their compassion becomes selective. Their love becomes conscious. They stop trying to save people and start choosing people who meet them where they are. What makes this stage transformative is not that the empath becomes a different person. It is that they finally become the person they were always meant to be, the one who loves deeply but not blindly, the one who gives generously but not self-destructively, the one who feels everything yet loses nothing of themselves in the process. This is the metamorphosis the narcissist never expected. The empath integrating the shadow, reclaiming their wholeness and stepping into a form of strength that no longer looks like softness, but sovereignty. Reconstruction is the phase where the empath stops surviving and begins rebuilding. It doesn't feel triumphant at first, it feels strangely quiet, like stepping into a larger version of yourself that you didn't know existed. After integrating the shadow, the empath is no longer trying to return to who they were. They are learning, often with surprising humility, who they are becoming. This stage is not about fixing what the narcissist broke. It is about restoring what the empath abandoned. The first sign of reconstruction is emotional neutrality. Not numbness, neutrality. The empath begins to respond to their inner world without panic, urgency, or self-blame. They observe their own triggers with curiosity rather than shame. They recognize their needs without apologizing for them. This is a psychological shift that marks the beginning of true adulthood, not the adulthood defined by years, but the adulthood defined by self-ownership. The adulthood defined by self-ownership. As this newfound neutrality stabilizes, the empath starts rebuilding the parts of their identity that were once outsourced to others. They no longer look to people for confirmation of their worth. They no longer confuse someone's attention with safety. They no longer try to earn love through self-erasure. Instead, they begin anchoring themselves in truth rather than approval. For the first time, the empath feels what it is like to be internally sourced rather than externally sustained. During reconstruction, relationships begin to look different. The empath becomes highly sensitive to emotional inconsistency. Not because it triggers them, but because they now recognize it as a warning sign rather than a puzzle to solve. They feel uncomfortable around manipulation, not because they feel guilty, but because their integrity rejects it. They are no longer drawn to intensity, they are drawn to stability, resonance, and clarity. They realize that peace is not the absence of conflict, it is the presence of self-respect. In this stage, the empath also learns something profound about boundaries. They are not walls, they are architecture. Boundaries shape the structure of a relationship, defining where connection can flourish and where it must not go. The empath begins setting boundaries without fear of losing people, because they finally understand that anyone who leaves because of a boundary was never meant to stay. What once felt like loss now feels like filtration. As reconstruction deepens, the empath becomes grounded in a way they never imagined possible. They speak slowly, they choose deliberately, they give consciously. Their emotional center is no longer scattered across other people's moods, expectations, or wounds. They carry themselves with a quiet presence, a presence that no longer begs to be understood, but simply exists with clarity. The narcissist no longer defines their emotional compass. The past no longer dictates their capacity to love, and the empath, once shaped by wounds, begins living from wisdom. They no longer react to life, they respond to it. They no longer fear loneliness, they understand solitude. They no longer attach quickly, they connect intentionally. This reconstruction is not a return to innocence, but a progression into wholeness. The empath becomes someone who can love without losing themselves, give without collapsing, and see without absorbing. They become the type of person who no longer attracts narcissists, not because narcissists disappear, but because the empath's healed energy leaves nothing for them to hook into. Reconstruction is the quiet revolution, where the empath steps into their life not as a survivor of harm, but as the architect of their future. And in this newly built inner world, love can finally enter and stay. True love does not arrive when the heart is open. It arrives when the heart is prepared. And preparation, for the empath, does not come through longing, waiting, or wishing. It comes through transformation. Only after the empath becomes whole does the universe bring a person who can meet them, match them, and walk beside them. Before this stage, the empath was searching for love from a place of emptiness, hoping someone would fill the gaps they had learned to ignore. But true love cannot exist where there is emotional hunger, because hunger turns connection into dependency. Wholeness, however, changes everything. It shifts the way the empath sees, chooses, and bonds. The empath who has reconstructed themselves no longer falls for intensity. They no longer interpret emotional turbulence as passion. They no longer mistake inconsistency for chemistry. They now crave something different, something steady, conscious, reciprocal. And because their inner world has changed, the types of people who enter their life also change. True love appears only after transformation, because before that point the empath would not have recognized it. They would have called it boring, too calm, or too slow. They would have pushed it away because it did not activate their wounds in familiar patterns. Genuine love does not feel like adrenaline. It feels like safety. It does not confuse, it clarifies. It does not drain, it nourishes. When the empath becomes whole, their energy becomes selective. They stop chasing potential and start responding to consistency. They stop trying to heal others and start choosing those who can meet them emotionally. They stop accepting crumbs and begin expecting integrity. Their inner frequency no longer matches the narcissist's hunger. It aligns with someone who brings stability, honesty, and depth. This is when the universe delivers the right person, not as a reward, but as a reflection. The healed empath attracts someone who also knows themselves, someone who isn't threatened by boundaries, someone who values emotional truth, someone who doesn't need to control love to feel safe. This person does not demand sacrifice, they create partnership. They do not pull energy, they exchange it. They do not love the empath's wounds, they love the empath's wholeness. And perhaps the most profound shift of all, the empath no longer loves from fear. They no longer fear abandonment because they no longer abandon themselves. They no longer fear rejection because they no longer reject their own needs. The love they offer comes from fullness, not desperation, making it a type of love that cannot be manipulated, drained, or distorted. True love appears only after the empath has walked through their inner darkness, because only then can they recognize what real light feels like. The universe waits for the moment when the empath can receive love without losing themselves in the process. And when that moment arrives, love does not appear as a test, a lesson, or a mirror. It appears as a companion, not to complete the empath, but to walk with them, side by side, equal, conscious, and free. In the end, the greatest paradox of the empath's journey is this: the universe does not send the wrong person to punish you, it sends them to prepare you. The narcissist was never the destination. They were the initiation. They were the storm that forced you to discover the foundations you didn't know you needed. They were the mirror that revealed the wounds you had hidden from yourself. They were the catalyst that broke the version of you that could not carry the life you were meant to live. And now, standing on the other side of everything you survived, you can finally see what you could not see then. You were never being destroyed, you were being rebuilt. You were never being abandoned, you were being redirected. You were never losing love, you were losing the illusions that kept you from recognizing real love. The empath who once lived through emotional chaos now carries a different kind of presence. Calm, grounded, sovereign. They no longer seek validation because they no longer doubt their worth. They no longer fear loss because they no longer fear themselves. They no longer chase the mirror of their wounds because they no longer need to reenact the past to feel familiar. This is why the narcissist had to come first. They exposed every unconscious pattern you could not grow beyond. They activated every wound that needed healing. They awakened the shadow you had spent years avoiding. They pushed you toward the transformation that would have never happened in comfort. And when the universe watched you rise from that breaking point, not hardened, but awakened, it knew you were ready. Ready to love without losing yourself, ready to choose without fear, ready to receive without collapsing, ready to walk beside someone who sees you not as a source of supply, but as a soul with depth, dignity, and direction. The truth is simple. The wrong person had to teach you what love is not, so the right person could show you what love truly is. Without the contrast, you would have settled. Without the wound, you would not have grown. Without the storm, you would not have become capable of holding the kind of love the universe was always preparing for you. And now, after everything, you stand in the quiet center of your life with a new kind of clarity. You understand that pain was not the end of your story, it was the door. You understand that healing was not an accident, it was an initiation. You understand that the universe did not send you a narcissist because you were weak. It sent you a narcissist because you were chosen to awaken. You walked through darkness, learned to see in the shadows, and returned carrying the light of your own truth. And when true love finally appears, you will meet it not as the broken version of who you once were, but as the sovereign version of who you became. Not searching for completion, but because you are already whole, not desperate for belonging because you belong to yourself, but afraid of losing love because you now know love cannot be lost when it is built on truth. This is the cosmic reason. The wrong person cracked you open, the healing rebuilt you, and the right person can now meet you because you finally meet yourself. Before you click away, remember this: you were never meant to stay in the chapter that broke you. You were meant to rise from it, clearer, stronger, and more sovereign than you ever imagined. The narcissist was not the end of your story. They were the doorway to the version of you that finally refuses to disappear inside someone else's chaos. And now, as you step forward, you carry something no one can take from you: discernment, self-respect, and the power to choose love that aligns with your soul, not your wounds. So if this message found you today, it's because the universe is whispering. You're not just healing, you're becoming. And the love that's meant for you, the love that doesn't drain, distort, or demand your self-abandonment, is closer than you think. This is your turning point. Walk forward with clarity. Walk forward with sovereignty. And above all, walk forward as the person you finally reclaimed. Welcome back to yourself. Your next chapter begins now.